is still a deeply moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now. Just moments ago, the palace broke its silence, and what followed left the nation speechless. The grandeur of Buckingham's walls could no longer hold the whispers that had been echoing for months. In a carefully worded statement, assistants confirmed what many feared, but few dared to say out loud. A date has been set. King Charles, the man who waited a lifetime for the crown, has chosen when he will step away. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The statement lasted less than 3 minutes, yet its impact was huge. The atmosphere in the briefing room was unlike anything reporters had experienced in years. Eyes darted across the room, pens trembled mid-sentence, and a collective stillness hung heavy in the air. A single line within the palace's announcement turned whispers into reality. His Majesty has reached a final decision regarding the timeline of his abdication. Those words, spoken with careful restraint, cut through months of speculation and uncertainty. The palace's tone was deliberately restrained, almost ceremonial. But those inside the room sensed the weight behind every syllable. Veteran royal reporters later admitted that it felt less like a press briefing and more like a turning point in history. This wasn't a rumor to be debated, nor a temporary arrangement. This was final. For years, Charles had been portrayed as the monarch who would never let go. Now, the palace itself was acknowledging the end of his reign was no longer a distant theory, but a scheduled reality. As the briefing ended, a low hum filled the air. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Photographers zoomed in on every tight jaw and lowered gaze of royal assistants, trying to decode the emotions they were too disciplined to express. Some assistants were pale, others visibly emotional. One journalist described the atmosphere as funeral-like, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Outside the palace gates, a crowd had already started to gather, united not by celebration, but by stunned disbelief. Behind this calm announcement, there was something way more complicated unfolding. The date itself was shrouded in mystery, but whispers started to swirl almost instantly. Senior reporters hinted that the chosen day wasn't random. It held a symbolic weight connected, some said, to moments both deeply personal and historically charged within the royal family. Historians started speculating on national holidays, coronation anniversaries, and private family milestones, trying to predict which date had been carved into the pages of royal history. But perhaps the most striking revelation was that even senior members of the royal family were informed only hours before the public. Assistants close to the matter admitted off the record that several prominent royals received the news in hastily arranged phone calls earlier in the day. The abruptness shocked even the most seasoned palace workers. This wasn't the usual slow, deliberate royal rollout. It was sharp, decisive, almost uncharacteristically so for a monarch known for careful thinking. In those moments, the palace had managed to do what it rarely does: stun both the media and the monarchy itself. The confirmation didn't just announce an abdication date. It signaled that the transition had already begun behind closed doors. Decisions had been made in quiet rooms, and the statement was merely the public unveiling of a plan long in motion. The royal family, the government, and the nation were no longer dealing with what-ifs. The countdown had started. But behind that carefully staged announcement lies a storm of secrets, betrayals, and emotional reckonings that pushed Charles to this irreversible moment. To understand why Charles chose this moment, he must step inside the weight of a crown he chased for decades only to find it heavier than anyone imagined. Behind the ceremonial smiles, there were sleepless nights, whispers from doctors, and silent glances from within his family. Each passing month carved the toll deeper until the man who once dreamed of ruling began quietly yearning to let go. For more than 70 years, Charles stood in the shadow of destiny. His wait for the throne became the longest in British history, a lifetime spent preparing for a role that was always just out of reach. Yet, when the crown finally rested upon his head, the reality was far from the romanticized image he had nurtured. The shortness of his reign stood in stark contrast to the decades of anticipation. It was as if the crown, after being so desperately awaited, had arrived only to remind him how little time remained to wear it. What should have been a triumphant era turned into a relentless trial, one that tested his body, spirit, and resolve. Behind the grandeur, his health started to quietly fall apart. Private doctors expressed concern in hushed tones. Palace assistants noticed his increasing exhaustion, and close friends saw a man retreating into silence after public events. There were no dramatic collapses or televised emergencies, just a steady decline hidden behind the thick walls of royal protocol. Those around him whispered that the strain of the role was speeding up what the years had already begun. The pressure to be ever present, to embody stability in a turbulent world, slowly started to outweigh his physical and emotional reserves. Inside the palace, subtle shifts were underway long before the public sensed anything wrong. Key events once led by Charles were quietly handed off to others. Catherine and William started taking on more prominent roles, their presence at major events increasing with each passing season. It wasn't announced as preparation, but to those who watched closely, it was unmistakably a rehearsal. They represented continuity, a new chapter waiting in the wings. Even as Charles struggled to keep pace with the demands of the crown, assistants, ever discreet, noticed his withdrawal. He started leaving decisions to trusted staff more often, declining events he would once have led without hesitation. Late-night meetings became fewer. His once detailed involvement in royal affairs started to thin. It wasn't laziness or neglect. It was weariness, deep and unshakable. Those closest to him spoke of a monarch who no longer seemed to be looking ahead, but inward. A king questioning not his legacy, but his strength to sustain it. And through it all, an invisible battle grew between duty and self-preservation. Charles had been raised on the unyielding principle that the crown comes before the man. But now, for perhaps the first time, the man beneath the crown was quietly questioning that truth. The monarch, who had once represented unwavering patience, was now facing the cruel paradox of time. He had waited too long to rule, and now the role itself was draining what little remained of his vitality. And while Charles struggled with the weight of the crown, forces around him were already moving, some with loyalty, others with ambition. In the quiet hallways of Balmoral, a conversation took place that would change everything. Princess Anne, ever the steadfast confidant, confronted her brother with a chilling warning. She had seen what was coming not from doctors or palace workers, but from within the family itself. Her words were simple yet devastating. "They're preparing for a throne without you." It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. Anne had always been more than just Charles's sister. She was his most trusted ally, pragmatic, loyal, and unafraid to speak truths that others softened or buried beneath protocol. While the rest of the royal household often tiptoed around sensitive matters, Anne had the rare privilege of piercing through the royal front. Her closeness to Charles wasn't born of political necessity, but forged over decades of shared burden as the two eldest children of a monarch. And it was this deep bond that made her words that day land with such weight. Long before the palace issued its formal statement, Anne had started to detect the faint but undeniable tremors of shifting loyalty. It wasn't one grand betrayal, but a series of quiet, coordinated adjustments. Senior palace workers, once unwaveringly focused on Charles, had begun subtly redirecting their attention toward William and Catherine. Invitations were worded differently. Briefings became less inclusive. The tone inside the palace had shifted almost imperceptibly, but an ever-observant noticed. She saw a structure slowly repositioning itself for a future in which Charles was no longer at its center. When she confronted him, her tone carried both urgency and sorrow. She urged him to face what she believed was inevitable before others forced his hand. "You have to take control of this," she told him, "because if you don't, someone else will." It wasn't an attack, it was a plea. She knew that the monarchy had always relied on a balance between image and control. And right now, that control was slipping quietly into other hands. Behind the palace gates, William and Catherine's influence was expanding with remarkable subtlety. Palace workers, ever attuned to where power might shift, started aligning themselves with the future. William's briefings became longer. Catherine's schedule mirrored that of a queen in waiting. Their presence started to fill spaces Charles once dominated. It wasn't treachery. It was preparation. But to Anne, it was clear. The family was adjusting not for a distant era, but for a transition already in motion. She warned Charles about the senior staff who were already playing their own strategic games. These weren't overt coups, but quiet power plays, skillfully staged leaks, strategic scheduling. And whispers in hallways that shaped perception long before announcements did. The machinery of succession, once entirely under his authority, was slowly beginning to hum without him. Anne's voice that day carried more than political calculation. It carried the emotional weight of someone who knew her brother was at a crossroads. She pleaded with him not to let others script the ending of his reign. "If you don't define this moment, Charles," she said, "it will define you." Her warning wasn't just about logistics. It was about legacy. Her warning was more than sisterly concern. It was a spark that illuminated the palace's hidden fault lines. While the world fixated on Charles's every move, another figure was rising in quiet precision. Prince William, groomed for the future, yet bound by loyalty to his father, found himself walking a line between obedience and destiny. Each public appearance, each carefully worded speech, became a rehearsal for the inevitable, and behind palace doors, advisors started treating him not as the heir, but as the incoming king. In the months following Anne's private warning, William's role started to transform almost imperceptibly. His public events increased with calculated regularity, taking him across diplomatic tours, state visits, and national commemorations that had once been the king's domain. Speeches that were once politely observed were now analyzed for tone, strategy, and leadership. In each moment, the monarchy subtly shifted its center of gravity from the reigning sovereign to the one who would follow. For many, it felt like a seamless continuation of duty. But to those within the palace, it was clear. This was preparation. Behind the scenes, loyalties started to realign. Senior advisors who had spent decades serving Charles quietly began redirecting their attention toward William. It wasn't betrayal, it was instinct. The monarchy, like any institution, anticipates its future. And in William, many saw the next anchor of stability. Long-serving palace workers started offering him briefings first, deferring to his vision in strategy meetings and scheduling. His events with an authority that once belonged exclusively to his father. Their language changed too. "When you are king" started replacing "one day" as if the timeline had accelerated without ever being officially declared. Through this transition, Catherine emerged as a powerful, stabilizing force. Her presence beside William was both reassuring and commanding, signaling unity, continuity, and quiet strength. While William grappled with the weight of an impending crown, Catherine played the role of strategist and confidant, helping navigate the delicate balance between honoring Charles's reign and preparing for their own. Her growing visibility was not accidental. She embodied the future of the monarchy in a way that resonated with both the public and the palace elite. But this rise was not without tension. William faced an emotional crossroads. The desire to support his father fully, and the realization that the machinery around him was preparing for his reign with increasing urgency. Late at night, he started holding private meetings with trusted senior staff. Discussions that centered not on if, but when and how. These sessions were cloaked in secrecy, focusing on transition plans, ceremonial adjustments, and the intricate responsibilities that would one day be his. He was being prepared, and whether he admitted it or not, he was preparing himself. Yet beneath the composure, the emotional toll was mounting. Rumors intensified in the press. Speculation grew bolder, and public sentiment started to shift. Whispers of abdication intertwined with visions of a youthful monarch and a modernized crown. William knew these conversations were not happening in isolation. They were part of a larger momentum that he could neither stop nor openly acknowledge. Every new event, every handshake, every speech carried the silent weight of a future that was rapidly approaching. But no rise comes without shadows, and in the royal household, shadows often take the form of power struggles and secrets long buried. As the palace braced for change, Queen Camilla found herself in a storm she never imagined. Having fought for decades to be accepted, she now faced the prospect of losing everything not to scandal, but to time itself. Behind the closed doors of Clarence House, she pleaded with Charles to reconsider. Fearing her role, her title, and her legacy would all vanish the moment he stepped down. For years, Camilla had navigated public skepticism, private turmoil, and institutional resistance to carve out a place for herself beside Charles. She had endured scrutiny that would have broken others, slowly transforming from a controversial figure into a respected royal consort. But as whispers of abdication turned into confirmed plans, the foundation she had so carefully built started to feel like shifting sand beneath her feet. The title of Queen Consort had been hard-won. Now it seemed destined to fade quietly into history once Charles gave up the throne. Her conversations with Charles grew more emotional by the day. She begged him to delay, to reconsider, to hold on to the crown a little longer. For Camilla, the abdication wasn't just the end of his reign. It was the end of hers. She feared becoming a footnote in a swiftly changing royal narrative dominated by William and Catherine, whose popularity and modern image cast long shadows over her. In private, she admitted to confidants that stepping aside now felt like erasing her decades-long fight for acceptance. These private exchanges between husband and wife were tense, layered with love, but strained by differing visions of the future. Charles, weary and determined, believed the decision was necessary for the stability of the monarchy. Camilla, however, saw it as surrender. She questioned whether the monarchy would protect her legacy once the next chapter began, or whether history would quietly push her aside to make room for a new era. Those close to the couple described nights of heated discussions, tears, and long silences. Within the palace, advisors were split. Some fully supported Charles's decision, focusing on the seamless transfer of power to William. Others, however, worried about what Camilla's diminished role would mean for royal continuity and public perception. These divisions led to subtle infighting with palace workers, leaking information to journalists in carefully timed whispers. It wasn't long before reports emerged suggesting Camilla felt betrayed by history itself, as if all the sacrifices she had made were being overshadowed by a future she had no say in shaping. In her quiet way, Camilla started to rally what allies she had left. She reached out to sympathetic figures within the institution, subtly pressing for ways to slow the transition. She hoped to preserve some measure of influence, to keep the machinery from sweeping her aside entirely. But even her allies could see the tide turning. The plans were too advanced, the narrative too firmly in motion. Her struggle was less about changing the outcome and more about clinging to relevance in the face of inevitability. But Charles's decision was no longer merely personal. It had become a matter of national choreography, timed with symbolic precision. The moment that will define a generation has been set in stone. Behind the velvet curtains, advisors circled calendars. Historians weighed in, and Charles sat in silence as one date was quietly underlined. It was not chosen at random. It carried echoes of the past, whispered significance, and a final message from a king who understood legacy better than anyone else. The process of selecting the abdication date unfolded with a level of secrecy usually reserved for matters of state security. In private meetings attended by only the most trusted palace advisors, discussions grew intense. It wasn't simply about finding a convenient time. It was about crafting history. Every potential date was examined not just for logistical feasibility, but for its symbolic weight, its ability to speak to the past while ushering in a new future. This wasn't merely a calendar decision. It was a statement to the nation and to future generations. Charles, ever conscious of the monarchy's long narrative, listened carefully as advisors presented options tied to pivotal moments in royal history. Some suggested aligning the abdication with the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's rise to the throne, symbolizing a clean passing of the torch. Others pushed for dates connected to personal milestones in Charles's life, moments that would give his departure an intimate, almost poetic resonance. As the discussions deepened, Charles remained characteristically quiet, weighing not just the politics, but the emotion of the moment. In the end, the chosen date emerged with quiet inevitability. Those present described the atmosphere as solemn, almost reverential, as if everyone in the room understood they were witnessing the marking of a future historical chapter. A single stroke of a pen confirmed it, sealing months of speculation. From that moment on, everything would move toward that day. It was no longer theoretical. The end of Charles's reign had a date, a countdown that only a handful of individuals were initially allowed to know. Preparations began in near total secrecy. The palace formed a discreet task force to handle the intricate choreography of what would be the first royal abdication of the modern era. Legal teams reviewed centuries-old precedents. Ceremonial planners drafted outlines for the unprecedented handover, and security units prepared for a global media storm. Every department worked under strict instructions, absolute silence. Not a word was to leave the palace walls until the official announcement. Even as the plans accelerated, the emotional weight of the chosen date started to ripple through the family. Senior royals who had been kept in the dark were informed one by one, their reactions ranging from quiet acceptance to stunned disbelief. For some, it was a really structured path toward transition. For others, it was a sharp reminder that the era they had known all their lives was drawing to a close. The reality of the moment hit hardest behind closed doors, where titles, roles, and futures were quietly reconsidered in the wake of a single decision. As the world prepared to learn the date, the palace wrestled with one final question. How do you announce the end of an era? When dawn broke and the palace's statement finally reached the public, Britain stood still. Newspapers blared. Phones buzzed, and the air felt charged with something historic. For many, Charles had been a constant through turbulent decades. Now, his departure felt like losing a chapter of their own lives. Tears mixed with shock, and even those who had criticized him found themselves whispering, "It's really happening," across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, not in protest or celebration, but in quiet disbelief. Strangers spoke to one another in hushed tones, united by the weight of a shared moment. Elderly citizens who had witnessed his entire journey from heir to monarch wiped away tears while younger generations scrolled through their phones trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they were seeing. For many, Charles had always been there, an enduring figure in the backdrop of national life. And the thought of his reign ending so soon stirred a collective unease that words could hardly capture. The emotional outpouring was unlike anything seen in decades. Messages flooded social media platforms. Newspapers released special editions within hours, and broadcasters suspended regular programming to dissect every line of the palace's statement. Some voiced sadness and respect, acknowledging his decades of service. Others expressed shock, unable to reconcile the quiet inevitability of abdication with the grandeur of the monarchy's traditions. Even those who had long criticized his leadership found themselves pausing, realizing they were witnessing the close of an era in real time. The media machine shifted into overdrive. Analysts debated what the abdication meant for the future of the monarchy. Political commentators parsed every phrase for hidden significance, and historians were brought onto live broadcasts to provide context. The language of the statement itself, restrained, yet final, became the subject of intense scrutiny. It wasn't just news. It was history unfolding sentence by sentence, and the world was desperate to understand its implications. Political figures offered carefully measured responses from Downing Street to the regional governments. Statements were crafted to strike a balance between honoring Charles's service and embracing the new chapter that awaited. There was no room for missteps. Diplomacy and reverence intertwined as leaders acknowledged the gravity of a monarch voluntarily stepping aside in the modern age. The tone was universally respectful, solemn, and tinged with uncertainty about what this transition would mean for the nation's identity in the years ahead. Beyond Britain, world leaders and monarchies reacted swiftly. Messages of support and reflection poured in from across the globe, underscoring the international significance of the moment. Allies framed the abdication as a testament to Charles's self-awareness and dedication to the institution. Foreign media highlighted the rarity of such a move, painting it as both a historic shift and a deeply personal decision that would reverberate far beyond British shores. Amid this global response, a wave of nostalgia swept across the nation. Broadcasts revisited Charles's earliest public appearances, his speeches as Prince of Wales, and the milestones of his short but impactful reign. Archival footage played side by side with live coverage, reminding the public of his decades-long journey toward the throne and the quiet dignity with which he had chosen to step away. It wasn't just a political or ceremonial moment. It was an emotional reckoning for millions who had grown up with him as a symbol of continuity. Yet, while the nation absorbed the news, inside the palace walls, preparations for the most intricate royal handover in modern history were accelerating. As the abdication date loomed, every corner of the palace became a stage for the most choreographed transition since the days of Elizabeth. Behind gilded doors, dress rehearsals, document signings, and midnight briefings unfolded. Every step was planned, every emotion restrained. Yet beneath the regal precision, a simple truth echoed through the halls. A son is about to inherit a throne, and a father is about to say goodbye. In these final days, the palace transformed into a living machine of preparation. Legal teams finalized centuries-old procedures adapted for a modern world, ensuring that every constitutional requirement would be met without a single misstep. Documents were scrutinized line by line, their language bearing the weight of history. Every clause, every signature would mark the official transfer of power from one monarch to the next. It was a process steeped in both tradition and cold, unyielding legal language. A reminder that even the most emotional moments in royal history must be executed with precision. Beyond the paperwork, a delicate coordination took place across institutions that form the backbone of the monarchy. The Church prepared its role in blessing the transition. Parliament received quiet briefings to ensure political alignment, and military officials rehearsed ceremonial displays with flawless discipline. From the outside, the machinery appeared seamless. But within those walls, the stakes were felt acutely. Any error, no matter how small, could tarnish a moment meant to be remembered for generations. Meanwhile, William faced his own set of private rehearsals in rooms closed to all but a handful of trusted advisors. He practiced the weighty protocols he would soon enact publicly. Oaths, speeches, gestures were refined until second nature. Advisors reminded him that this was more than performance. It was the moment he would cease to be heir and become sovereign. Beneath his calm exterior, there was an undeniable gravity. He was stepping into the role for which his entire life had prepared him, but doing so under the emotional shadow of his father's departure. For Charles, these days were marked by quiet moments of reflection with those who had stood by him through the decades. Conversations with close assistants became more personal, filled with gratitude, regrets, and unspoken acknowledgments of a reign that was about to end sooner than many expected. Those who had served him longest noticed a softness in his demeanor. Not weakness, but the solemn awareness of closing a chapter that had defined him since childhood. Camilla's position grew increasingly fragile as the machinery of transition accelerated. Where once she had been central to Charles's reign, she now found herself watching from the periphery, her influence fading in real time. Meetings she once attended were handled without her. Decisions she had once shaped moved forward without her input. It was a painful reminder that power within the monarchy is inseparable from the crown itself. And once it is set down, everything shifts. Through all of this, Anne remained a steady presence. While others navigated emotion and ambition, she anchored the family with quiet strength, ensuring that the personal did not disrupt the historical. Her role was not to command or to lead, but to hold the center together during days when both family and institution balanced on a knife's edge. And then the day arrived. A day carved in history, not for a coronation, but for a farewell. The world watched as King Charles walked one last time through the palace hallways as sovereign. Cameras flashed, crowds gathered, and the air held a solemn electricity. It was the moment no one thought they'd live to see. A modern king stepping down on his own terms in full view of his people. As the clock struck the chosen hour, history bent, and a new era began. Every second of this day carried a weight that words could barely hold. Across the nation, millions held their breath as Charles emerged for his final public appearance as monarch. For decades, he had lived under the shadow of expectation, then briefly under the weight of the crown, and now he was stepping into the role of a monarch in farewell. His demeanor was measured, his expression grave. But beneath the ceremonial precision lay an unmistakable emotional current. This was not merely a formal act. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined a lifetime. The public ceremony announcing his abdication unfolded with meticulous grace. The palace had choreographed every detail to reflect both reverence for tradition and acknowledgement of the unprecedented moment. The abdication document, signed and sealed with centuries-old protocols, was read aloud to the nation. In that instant, the monarchy, an institution known for its steadfast continuity, embraced a historic change in real time. Applause did not erupt. Instead, there was a stillness, a shared understanding that something profound was happening. William and Catherine stood beside Charles, poised and deliberate, embodying both the respect for the past and the confidence of the future. Their presence spoke volumes without a single word. To the public, they represented stability, a seamless transition from one generation to the next. William's expression carried the gravity of the moment, while Catherine's quiet composure reinforced the message that the crown was not faltering, it was evolving. Together, they stood as living symbols of what lay ahead. Amid the grandeur, Camilla's quiet, tearful reaction revealed the deeply personal cost of the day. For years, she had walked this journey with Charles through public scorn, private battles, and eventual acceptance. Watching him step away was not just the end of his reign, it was the end of their shared chapter as sovereign and consort. Those close to her described a woman holding back emotion, aware that while the world saw a royal figure, she saw her husband reaching the conclusion of a destiny he had carried for a lifetime. And ever the steady force offered a subtle but powerful gesture of support. As Charles moved through the final formalities, her presence beside him was unwavering. She had been his confidant, his mirror of truth. And now she stood as his anchor in the moment when the crown began to pass from one head to another. Her quiet strength underscored the human reality behind the spectacle, brother and sister facing history together. The ceremony concluded not with fanfare, but with reflection. As the final words were spoken, the crowd erupted into applause tinged with emotion. It wasn't jubilation. It was gratitude, respect, and a collective recognition of witnessing something that would be remembered for generations. Charles's abdication was not a retreat, but a deliberate act of a monarch choosing to define his own ending, gifting the throne to the future before time forced his hand. And as the crown prepares to rest on a new head, the echoes of Charles's reign will linger. A bittersweet chapter closed before the eyes of the world.